Mark from the States, Mark from the States, it's Mark from the United States.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Mark from the States, how we doing today? I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate all of you coming back. I just love it. Today, we're going to look at a video from the History Guy. Links to this video and to his channel are below me. Okay, just scroll down a little bit. You'll see the links there. Just click on them. Go to his channel, support. He's got so many great videos. He's got tons of different playlists. This video is called Forgotten, the Lost Crew of RMS Titanic. Now, we know a lot about the Titanic, of course, but this is a tale, I think, of what happened to the crew. We certainly know and heard stories about famous passengers that were on the boat, and of course the captain and maybe some of the others that were on the brig that night, bridge that night. But maybe this is going to go into more of the other crew members of the ship. This video is and has been requested, so thank you so much for that. So yeah, I'm interested. It's such a fascinating piece of our history that there's always seems to be twists and turns the more we actually learn about it. And yes, like I said, I've heard a lot and seen a lot about it, but there's really so much more that I'm hoping to learn. So, big couch, yes, it's not real, but it will hold all of you. I appreciate everyone who has sent me emails wishing Florida and, of course, North Carolina and Tennessee and Georgia the best, in dealing with these hurricanes. Last night, one hit Florida, Milton, that was unique because as you know, most of the hurricanes, they originate in the Atlantic down by the tip of Africa, and they make their way across and then get into the Caribbean and pick up their warm water, and that's where they get the size that they get. And this one, Milton, originated in the Caribbean off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. So you're not seeing it at such a distance, coming across the Atlantic. It's boom, right there. And it got so big so fast. And, just crazy watching this thing come ashore. I was glued to the TV last night watching all the news coverage of it. Last night is when it really kind of came shore, right there on the west coast of the Florida coastline. And a lot of flooding. Of course, the storm inevitably downsizes the categories. It was 5, 4, then 5, and then 4, and I think once it made landfall, I think at a category 3. But that's really not important. The important part is the storm surge, the water, and that doesn't change based on category designation, from what I understand. That it'll still bring a category 3 will still bring the same large amounts of water, storm surge, that a category 5 will. At least that's my quick knowledge that I think I'm understanding from watching the Weather Channel for the last 24 hours. No expert, that is for sure. But so a lot of some people have unfortunately have passed away already. One of the crazy side effects that the storm has been bringing is tornadoes. Florida doesn't get a lot of tornadoes, but they certainly had a bunch yesterday, and that was wild. So in the preamble, the opening act to the storm hitting the shore were these tornadoes touching down, which there's some videos out there that is just, wow, blowing roofs off, moving vehicles, and I think some people did pass away. from these tornadoes, and I just pray for their families. I pray for the safety of all Floridians, and of course, continued hope for the people of North Carolina who are still struggling, and of course, we're doing all we can. I'm proud of the Americans who've stepped up and helped out, and yeah, it's just a tough deal. It's just a tough deal. We go through this every year. That's why there's a hurricane season. It's tough to. We know some friends who moved to Florida, right there on the West Coast near Tampa Bay, where this essentially made landfall. And we know some friends of ours who moved here from Ventura, and they moved there. And it's just like knowing what you know with the hurricanes and stuff. It's just, but yeah, it's wild. Crazy story though. The friend of ours, he is works in the Los Angeles Fire Department, and he's kind of up there, and he will fly. So he works, block schedule. He'll work for like 10 straight days or whatever it is, and then he's off for 10 days, however that works. And he lives in Florida, flies back to LA, does his shift of however many days, and then flies home. He stays at the firehouse, and yeah, crazy. That's quite the commute, a 5.5 hour flight. So that just shows you how expensive it is to live in California. But yeah, they're doing. As far as I know, they're doing well. Haven't heard about any reports of damage to their homes. Last year there was a big hurricane, or a couple years ago there was a hurricane that came through where they lived in it. They were just in the middle of remodeling their home, their new home that they bought, so they had to kind of fix some things. But so far so good from what I understand. But yeah, crazy knowing. It's like living in California and dealing with wildfires or, earthquakes. It's just kind of comes with the territory, and I guess you learn to live with it, I guess. Anyway, off topic, on a tangent, I apologize. Today's video, Forgotten, the Lost Crew of RMS Titanic. It is by the History Guy, so please go and support his channel. Links, again, are below. And let's do this.
The name Titanic still captures the public interest today, 112 years after the great ship was lost. The sinking of RMS Titanic has been the subject of some 500 books, nearly a score of feature-length films, more than 24 documentaries, and to date 4 permanent museums. And yet, despite all the interest in what is perhaps the most notable maritime disaster in history, some stories of the Titanic are still relatively unknown. Of all the classes of people who sailed aboard the ship, the one that had the highest rate of casualties was the great ship's crew, less than a quarter of whom survived.
Wow.
The lost crew of RMS Titanic and the people they left behind deserve to be remembered.
Absolutely.
David Randall wrote in the newspaper The Independent in 2012, "In the 100 years since the Titanic sank, one group of people on board have been reduced to the role of mere ballast. Nameless in almost all accounts of the sinking, they were nevertheless the most numerous and suffered losses which made even third-class passengers seem privileged. They were the crew, the poor, bloody, loyal crew." According to the website TitanicFacts.com, of the 2,224 people aboard the Titanic when the ship sank on April 15th, 1912, approximately 900 were members of the crew. In her 2022 book, The Titanic and the City of Widows It Left Behind, Julie Cook notes that being hired on for the crew of the Titanic would have been particularly important to the workers of Southampton in 1912. In February of 1912, coal miners had called a national coal strike with an aim of securing a minimum wage. In a world of ships powered by steam, coal was its lifeblood. Without it, ships remained in dock, unable to sail. As a result, workers were laid off. It's fair to say that, she writes, for the poor, life that year was grim and far more about survival than living. The desperation made some crews sign on when they otherwise might not have. One example was Arthur William May, a fireman's messman, meaning a cook for the crew. At age 59, May was one of the oldest members of the crew.
Wow.
The Brantford, Ontario Daily Expositor wrote, according to Mrs. May, Mr. May was prevented from joining his old vessel, the Britannia, through a bad leg, and only on the day before the Titanic sailed
bad
did
luck.
he decide to sign up, owing to hard times at home. His son, Arthur William May Jr., 23 years old, was aboard as a fireman, being one of the men who shoveled coal into the boilers, men who were so covered in coal dust that were referred to as the Black Gang. His mother said that he would not have gone to sea had he not been deprived of his regular work on land by the coal strike. This was, the expositor writes, the father and son's first voyage together.
That's just heartbreaking. I mean, bad luck. He wants to be on the Britannia. He ends up signing on here. His son is there. I had no idea about the coal strike going on. So a lot of these, from what I'm understanding, a lot of these people desperate for work are signing up to join the crew, which in another time would have never happened. Oh, it's just heartbreaking. 900 crew. That seems like a lot. But I guess it's because I'm trying to compare it to a modern cruise liner. They don't have the need for people to shovel coal. Everything is computerized, and the modern technology of shipping these days takes less people to operate. But but even on some of those huge cruise ships, there's still over 1,000 crew members. But a lot of them are passenger, like they deal with passengers, whether it's entertainment, food service, waiters, waitresses, that sort of thing.
Both men had need of work. Mr. and Mrs. May had 10 children to keep, while the younger May had been married just 11 months previously. The expositor writes that the young couple have a baby of a few weeks and live with Mr. and Mrs. May. At the time the Examiner published the story on May 4th, Mrs. May had no news of her husband and son, but neither survived. They were not the only workers driven by the strike. The Liverpool Weekly Mercury wrote that many of the Southampton members of the crew distrusted the ship. That might have had to do with a fire that occurred previously in the ship's boiler room. Cook writes that the ship suffered a fire in one of its boiler rooms before she even left Belfast. As a result, some crew from Belfast refused to sail and gave up their positions on Titanic. It freed up jobs once the ship arrived in Southampton.
Wow.
Some who took those jobs, the Mercury contends, would never have sailed on her, but for their homes being swept bare by the strike. The desperation caused by the coal strike made the losses even more devastating when the ship sank. The expositor writes that there are indeed several cases of members of the crew making first voyage, and others have been previously who had been out of employment for some time, rendering the plight of those left behind even more desperate. Still, it was not easy to get on with the ship. A brother of a crew member told the Mercury that of the 900 members of the crew, the greater part of them were picked men who had served on the maiden voyage of the Olympic. This applied even to the youngest members of the crew. Fred Hopkins had, encyclopediatitanica.org writes, given his age as 16 when he signed on to the crew. But in reality, the webpage writes, he was several months shy of his 15th birthday. A plate steward, meaning that he bussed and washed plates for
So
a salary
young.
of £3, 15 shillings a month. He had already done the same job aboard the Olympic. William Watson, also 14, was a cabin bellboy, earning £2 a month. Also just 14, he had served previously in the position aboard Olympic. The two were the youngest members of the Titanic's crew. Neither survived.
Oh,
Perhaps as interesting were the crew members who weren't there. There were the workers in Belfast, but in addition, the Mercury writes it is attested that one fireman who believed that something was sure to happen deserted at Queenstown, Ireland.
Wow.
Encyclopedia Titanica writes that the man was 23-year-old John Coffey, who had served aboard Olympic. Reports stated, the encyclopedia writes, that he had a foreboding of disaster, possibly a fire, but it may simply have been that he wanted a passage to his home in Queenstown and always intended to leave the ship. He signed on with another vessel, the Mauritania, the next day.
All right. There's something about that ship that sounds familiar. I don't know why that ship. I don't know, but that is, it's so sad. These people, just the terrible luck. It's funny how they all think, or most of them thought it was going to be fire. If there was something bad going to happen, it was going to be a fire in the boiler room.
Notable is the story of the Slade brothers. The Telegraph wrote in 2012 the brothers Bertram, Tom, and Alfred Slade had signed on as firemen on Titanic. On the morning of the departure, they'd been drinking in the Grapes pub in Oxford Street. Still there, contains bits and bobs of Titanic memorabilia. Until 11:50 a.m., 10 minutes before the Titanic's scheduled departure. Staggering out, they had to wait for a dock's train to pass, and when they reached the ship, the gangplank had been raised, and they missed the voyage. The website of the Grapes writes that despite the fact that he could have let the brothers on, the officer in charge of the gangway refused to lower it. Southampton docks were packed with sailors desperate for work, and when the brothers did not board, he had taken new men on to replace them. The Mercury wrote after the sinking that the brothers are now congratulating themselves on having missed the boat.
Heck yeah.
They had reason to congratulate themselves, as the Grapes notes that the men hired to replace them did not return. The Slade brothers might have lost their jobs that day, the restaurant's website notes, but they had saved
Their lives. Yeah.
It is surprising that in the many newspaper headlines, including ones proclaiming rich passengers like Major Archibald Budd and John Jacob Astor as heroes, there was so little discussion of the actions of the crew that night that the Titanic struck the iceberg. Randall writes, on Sunday, 14 April, just before midnight, Titanic struck an iceberg 400 miles off of Newfoundland and sank within 2 hours, 40 minutes. The actions of the 9 senior officers, 4 of whom survived, are well known. But the Southampton men, the bellboys, lift boys, boot boys, bakers, soup cooks, wine butlers, stewards, stokers, clerks, and greasers, there are only glimpses. The crew had many functions. National Geographic writes that on board there were more than 900 crew members, including wait staff, engineering, and deck crews. Deck crews included able seamen, boatswain's mates, quartermasters, storekeepers, as well as 2 ship's doctors. The website A Look Through Time explains that there were 322 stewards and 23 female crew aboard, performing more than 57 different functions in the dining salons of each class, public rooms, cabins, and recreational facilities. Today, we would refer to these men and women as a waiter, waitress, maid, or attendant. In addition, A Look Through Time explains there were 62 individuals working in the galley and kitchen. These consisted of chefs, cooks, bakers, butchers, and scullions. Randall writes of the difficult position of these crew. Stewards ushered passengers to the boat decks, helped with life jackets, or gave them their own to wear. No member of the crew rode away in a lifeboat, save those ordered in one by an officer. They knew they were the lowest priority on a doomed liner. And some, such as the restaurant staff, even accepted being locked into their quarters. They did their duty, which on a ship carrying 2,223 people and lifeboats only half that number, was basically to die. The rule aboard lifeboats was women and children first, and that aided the much smaller portion of the crew who were female. According to TitanicFacts.net, 20 of the 23 female crew survived, whereas the fatality rate among male crew members was 78%.
Yikes.
Of 69 restaurant staff, only 1 survived. The 8 members of the Titanic's orchestra, playing on deck as the ship sank to calm passengers, all perished. The 5 postal clerks in charge of the 3,364 mail bags being carried all perished. The Smithsonian National Postal Museum writes, during Titanic's sinking, the 5 clerks on board tried desperately to save the mail, and in the process forfeited any chance they may have had to escape the doomed ship. The deck.
People were just different back then. They did everything they could to save the mail. It's just astounding and sad. When you hear about stories like this with people who, for instance, those brothers that were drinking in a pub and drank too much and were late and failed to get on the ship. It's just, how does the world work like that? You know, it's just so random how some people make decisions not on purpose, but just how it happened. It's just by chance. They chose to be late or to drink more or be in a pub for that matter, which then basically saved their lives. While others looking for work probably at the time thought, this is our lucky day. 2 people didn't show up, so we got to get on. Just insane. The guy who maybe just used the ship to get off at the next port before it went into the Atlantic, sailed off, chose to get off the boat, whether it was by design or not, I don't know. But such a weird feeling it must be to make that decision and not be on the ship for however it turned out that you didn't go on or got off, and then you hear later that the ship sank and all these people perished, and it must be just a weird feeling. You're happy, of course, then maybe sad, and then you start having depression because, you know, you have the weight of all these other people, and then some probably think, well, what's in store for me? I must be destined for greater things. It's interesting.
Process forfeited any chance they may have had to escape the doomed ship. The deck crew had a much better chance of escape, but still not all chose to. Encyclopedia Titanica writes that after the collision, as the water reached sea deck, Assistant Surgeon John Edward Simpson, 37, said with ship surgeon Dr. William Francis O'Laughlin, 62, Chief Purser Herbert McElroy, 32, and Assistant Purser Reginald Barker, 42. None would survive.
Wow.
Randall writes that at the last moments of the ship, McElroy was seen near the gym with a few other crew. He shook them by the hand and said, "Well, goodbye, fellows. It looks like sand for breakfast tomorrow." The ship's 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips, 25, who was known as Sparks because he could send Morse code so fast, and Harold Bride, 22, also perished.
I just want to point out right now, I noticed the first pinned comment to this video, the original video by the History Guide, he has a correction. And I just want to state that to you. Harold Bride did not perish, and he has a correction there. Apparently he survived. Not quite sure how he survived, but he did, and lived till 1956 or something like that. So just wanted to point that out.
He could send Morse code so fast, and Harold Bride, 22, also perished. They continued to send wireless messages calling for help. When the captain finally told them to leave, they had just 3 minutes before the ship sank.
Dang.
But there was a terrible struggle below decks.
Makes his
In his
survival
book,
more
Down Amongst the Black
impressive.
Gang, Richard P. de Kerbreck lists 317 engine room personnel, from Joseph Bell, the chief engineer, to the 161 firemen who stoked
Excuse
the
me.
boilers and the 72 trimmers who carried coal to them. The engineers, de Kerbreck writes,
I need to
the
go
engine room
back because
personnel,
I'm sneezing.
from Joseph Bell, the chief engineer, to the 161 firemen who stoked the boilers and the 72 trimmers who carried coal to them. The engineers, de Kerbreck writes, were responsible for the management and organization of the men in the engine room and boiler rooms, together with the smooth, efficient, and safe running of the boilers and main steam engines. The job of a fireman was not an easy one, de Kerbreck writes. They tended 3 fires, 2 high and 1 low, and the task of keeping them at full blast demanded a good standard of physical fitness. If they were sometimes stripped to the waist, sweat, burns, and aching muscles were wreaked upon their bodies. Their pay was £6 a month, all found. The Guardian reported in 2012 little is recorded of the 35 members of the engineering staff, all of whom lost their lives. With no survivors, the official inquiry into the sinking had no first-hand account of the actions and bravery of these men who stayed at their posts and endeavored to save the ship from sinking. Keeping the pumps running also meant keeping power, which meant that the boilers had to keep running as well. Technology writer Bruce Boyce writes about that on his blog, I Take History with My Coffee. Throughout the night, the crew managed to prevent the boilers from exploding while providing the ship with enough power to generate electricity. Electricity was vital, kept the lights on throughout the ship, allowing people to find their way in the maze of hallways and stairways towards the lifeboats. Electricity also kept the wireless telegraph operating, and the operators could send out distress calls up to the last moment. There was enough power to work the bilge pumps in a futile effort of removing water. Many agree that the engineering crew's Herculean labors brought the Titanic at least another hour before she sank.
That's amazing. Yeah, I didn't know any of that. That's amazing. Just remarkable men. It's so hard to even grasp what, how that you were able to just stay at your post knowing this is it. Without that, the fight or flight taking over and wanting to save yourself or save others, or, I mean, they are saving others. I mean, the fact that they're thinking these guys kept it afloat for an extra hour allowed that many more people to get off the ship, allowed them to, from what I'm understanding, contact any ships nearby that, Mayday call, distress call. This is deep. This is a lot. This is hitting me a little bit harder than I thought it would. These are the nameless, the faceless, people that you'll never hear about. Just incredible.
The Lancaster, Pennsylvania Examiner reported that the engineers stayed by the pumps and went down with the ship. The firemen and stokers were sent on deck 5 minutes before the Titanic sank, when it was seen that they would inevitably be lost if they stayed any longer at their work of trying to keep the fires and the boilers and the pumps at work. Only 72 of the 317 members of the engineering crew survived.
Wow.
Randall writes of the 899 crew who sailed on the ship, 686 perished, a death rate of 76%, worse than any class of passenger, even steerage. These, he writes, truly are the forgotten victims of the Titanic. Hundreds of husbands, brothers, fathers, sons, and sweethearts reduced by history, as they are by any film of the sinking, to mere anonymous extras. But they weren't the only casualties, Randall continues. Even more ignored by any film or popular account of the disaster are the families left behind. The expositor writes that Southampton, the home of the Titanic crew, has mourners in almost every street. This is the greatest shipping disaster the town has ever known. While flags have been flown at half-mast on the public buildings and in the docks, the town has plunged into tragic gloom. Nearly 1,000 families are directly concerned in the fate of the crew alone, and in most cases the only breadwinner in the family is lost. The Mercury wrote that several hundred of the men were married, and many of them had large families. Many sad cases in the district of Kingsland have come to my notice, telegraphs the Southampton correspondent of the Daily Chronicle. There are 4 widows in that street, remarked a tradesman, pointing to a few homes across the way. One of them is left with 9 little ones.
Oh, gosh.
The expositor reported in some of the poorer streets in which firemen and seafarers live in large numbers, very sad sights have been witnessed. In some streets, nearly every house is represented on board the Titanic. York Street is in the center of Northam, which provided nearly all of the trimmers and firemen of the lost liner, and 15 families in the street have lost a father or a son. There was some compensation for those left behind. Much of the crew were members of the Seafarers Union, which had only been formed the October before.
Whoa.
The widows and dependents of the members of the union were entitled to a death benefit of £5. Money was raised for a relief fund, started by the mayor of London.
£5.
While the fund was certainly an aid, its many rules in many ways kept the families in poverty and desperation. Writing in a 2012 edition of the English Historical Review, Sarah Gregson of the University of New South Wales concludes, the Titanic Relief Fund reflected an enormous international philanthropic impulse to help the victims' families. Despite the obvious generosity and sympathy behind the donations, Titanic dependents on the fund were treated more as beggars than as citizens with rights. All those movies and books and documentaries about the Titanic have tended to focus on the millionaire captains of industry, on the actions of the senior crew, of the passengers' stories, even fictional passengers like Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet's Jack and Rose. But the common crew, the firemen and the engineers, the pursers and the stewards who went down with their ship have largely been, Randall notes, written out of the script. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can
Yes, go over there, support him. It's important that you get over and support the History Guy and his channel. Like, subscribe, do the thing. They've given their blessing for us to be able to watch their videos and for me to learn, hopefully for you to find some interesting things and learn some things as well. This was a unexpected story. I want to thank you for the suggestion, the request. I'm so glad I got to see this. This is, I didn't think it would hit me as hard as it did. It's just sad. All these people, because he's totally right. You do not know about the crew other than the officers and the captain and, those people. Of course, you heard about the musicians playing on deck. And of course, those are all been shown in movies and whatnot, but you don't get the stories of these guys that nobody knew about, and hearing some of their heroic actions to keep the ship going just for that extra hour. You can only imagine how much or how many lives were saved, and it's just a wild hearing about the ones that missed the ship, or one that had a bad feeling about it and elected not. Boy, people probably held that guy in, like, wow, you could totally feel that. You knew it was going to happen. And then just the burden of surviving, or the burden of not going by chance, if that was even a thing. I don't know. People felt that way. 5 pounds. That's what they got paid for being in that union. But I mean, I guess it's something. Just seems small. But and the people who were on the list for donations, they thought it was a bad. Can you imagine if that was still a thing today? If charities would, you receive charity from people, put you on this, like, you are just begging for money. That'd be horrible. I don't know. This was good. I like I said, I didn't expect it to kind of hit me as hard. And just these towns that where these crew were from, so many people were affected. It gives you that feeling of like in World War I, right? And just where villages and towns throughout the land were, decimated by the sons and husbands being killed in war, and it just totally changes the whole town. That's what it kind of reminds me of. Wild. I hope you enjoyed that. Hope everybody's happy, healthy, and safe. Please, again, go over to History Guy. In fact, watch this video again without me. give him, the love. I really enjoy him. Of course, you all know why I have this fascination of this connection with my father. If you don't know and you're new and you want to know why, just ask me in an email or something. But most of you have heard the story, and I'm not going to repeat it. But go over there and support their channel. Just one like helps a lot. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for coming. And we will, see you tomorrow. Yeah. I was going to tell you about my visit to the sleep study doctor, but I'll tell you about that in another video. Have a good one. Take care. Bye.
Mark from the States, Mark from the States, it's Mark